Jimmy Fallon was in the middle of his opening monologue, complaining about the brutal New York winter, when a voice from the audience stopped him cold. "I've been living on the streets for 3 years," said the quiet woman in the fifth row. "I forgot what it feels like to complain about the cold." The studio fell silent so abruptly, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Jimmy's smile froze mid-sentence, his joke about winter weather dying in his throat. 300 audience members turned as one to stare at the source of those devastating words. It was Tuesday, December 15th, and The Tonight Show was taping their final episodes before the holiday break. The energy had been festive. The audience bundled up from the snow outside, laughing at Jimmy's observations about last-minute Christmas shopping and frozen car doors. But Margaret Thompson had something far more important than comedy on her mind. She sat alone in seat 5G, her weathered hands folded neatly in her lap. The thick winter coat she wore was clean but clearly secondhand, patched carefully with navy blue thread that didn't quite match. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, secured with a rubber band that had seen better days. Despite everything, Margaret carried herself with unmistakable dignity. Her posture was perfect, the bearing of someone who had spent decades standing in front of classrooms, commanding respect through presence rather than volume. Even in her circumstances, she looked like what she had always been, a teacher. Jimmy had noticed her during the pre-show warm-up because she wasn't laughing. While 300 other audience members roared at his jokes about celebrity impressions, Margaret sat quietly, observing everything with intelligent brown eyes. There was something about her stillness that drew attention, a gravity that seemed out of place in the festive atmosphere. The show's warm-up comedian had tried to engage her. "What's your name, ma'am?" he'd asked, pointing toward her. "Margaret," she'd replied simply, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. "Where are you from, Margaret?" the comedian had continued. "Brooklyn," she'd answered, but offered nothing more. The comedian had moved on, but Jimmy remembered thinking there was more to this woman's story than she was sharing. Now, as Margaret stood slowly in response to his winter weather bit, Jimmy realized he had been right. "Ma'am," he said, setting down his note cards and stepping closer to the audience. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Margaret rose to her full height, all 5 feet 4 inches of her, and when she spoke again, her voice carried across the studio with the clarity of someone who had spent 4 decades making sure children in the back row could hear every word. "I said I've forgotten what it's like to complain about being cold." The cameras swung toward her automatically, but the operators behind them understood this wasn't entertainment anymore. Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "When you sleep in doorways and under bridges, when you wake up with frost on your blanket, you learn that cold is just another challenge to survive." Jimmy's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, realization, and finally, profound sadness. "You sleep outside?" he asked, his host persona completely abandoned. Margaret nodded once, a simple gesture that carried the weight of 3 years of nights without shelter. "Every night for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, she said with the precision of someone who had been counting. "But who's keeping track?" She allowed herself a small smile at her own dark humor. Behind the scenes, the control room erupted in whispered conversations. Producers frantically gestured at monitors, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial, but the cameras kept rolling, capturing something unprecedented in late-night television history. Jimmy stood frozen for a moment, clearly struggling with how to respond. Then he did something that defined his character forever. He set down his microphone, stepped off the stage, and walked directly toward Margaret's row. The audience parted like the Red Sea, creating a path for their host. Jimmy moved with purpose, his expensive shoes clicking on the studio floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the absolute silence. When he reached Margaret's row, he stopped and looked directly into her eyes. "Ma'am, I'm Jimmy Fallon," he said, as if she might not know where she was. "What's your name?" The question was gentle, respectful, the way you might address a dignitary or honored guest. "Margaret Thompson," she replied, extending her hand with the grace of someone meeting a colleague at a faculty mixer. I was a third-grade teacher at PS 84 in Brooklyn for 43 years. The revelation hit Jimmy like a physical blow. His mouth fell open slightly as the implications sank in. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to educating children, now reduced to sleeping on the streets of the city she had served. "You were a teacher," Jimmy's voice cracked slightly on the words. Margaret nodded, and for the first time that evening, her expression softened into something resembling the smile that had once encouraged thousands of young students. "I retired in 2019, she said simply. 43 years in the same school, teaching the same grade, loving every day of it." Her voice carried the wistfulness of someone remembering a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Jimmy's mind raced, trying to understand how someone goes from retired teacher to homeless in just a few years. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "may I ask what happened?" Margaret's smile never wavered, but her eyes grew distant. "My husband Richard developed pancreatic cancer 2 years after I retired. We thought we had good insurance, good savings, a good plan." She paused, collecting herself. "The treatments weren't covered," she continued. "Experimental therapies, out-of-network specialists, travel costs for clinical trials. We mortgaged the house, then sold it, then spent Richard's pension trying to buy him more time." The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Margaret continued, "Richard died anyway, 16 months ago. The medical bills kept coming even after the funeral. I lost the apartment, then the car, then everything else." Jimmy felt tears forming in his eyes. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he whispered. Margaret reached out and touched his arm gently, the gesture of a teacher comforting a troubled student. "Don't be sorry for me, Mr. Fallon," she said firmly. "I had 43 years with the best man who ever lived, and 43 years doing work that mattered. That's more than many people get." The audience was openly crying now, but Margaret wasn't finished with her story. "I may not have a home," she said, her voice growing stronger, "but I still have purpose. I volunteer at the homeless shelter on Thursday mornings, reading to the children who end up there with their parents." "You read to homeless children?" Jimmy asked, struggling to process the layers of tragedy and grace in front of him. Margaret nodded enthusiastically. "Education doesn't stop just because life gets hard," she said with the conviction of someone who had lived that truth. "Those children need to know that learning matters, that books can take you anywhere, that their circumstances don't define their future." Jimmy made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Without consulting producers or considering television protocols, he began removing his suit jacket right there in front of 300 witnesses. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, holding the jacket open like a gallant knight offering his cloak to a lady, "would you do me the honor of accepting this?" Margaret looked confused. "I can't take your jacket, Mr. Fallon," she protested. "It's too expensive, too nice for someone like me." Jimmy shook his head firmly. "You're exactly the kind of person who should be wearing expensive things," Jimmy continued. "You're exactly the kind of person who deserves warmth, comfort, and respect." The jacket was too big for Margaret's small frame, but she wore it like royal robes. The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the programmed response of a television taping. This was genuine emotion, recognition, and gratitude rolled into one overwhelming sound. Margaret stood straighter, accepting the acknowledgement she had been denied for too long. But Jimmy wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire studio, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had found his true purpose. "This woman has educated thousands of New York City children. She's shaped minds, changed lives, created teachers, doctors, artists, and leaders." And tonight, Jimmy continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "she's sleeping on the streets of the city she served for 43 years. That's not just wrong, it's a disgrace to everything we claim to value as a society." Margaret raised her hand slightly, asking permission to speak. The gesture was so inherently teacher-like that several audience members smiled through their tears. When Jimmy nodded, Margaret turned to face the camera directly. "If you're watching this, and you're struggling," she said, her teacher voice carrying clearly across the studio, "if you've lost your home, your job, your hope, I want you to know something important." She paused, making sure she had everyone's attention. "You are not invisible," Margaret declared. "You matter. Your story matters. Your tomorrow matters." She pulled Jimmy's jacket closer around her shoulders, a gesture of both comfort and defiance. "I know this because I spent 43 years teaching children who thought they didn't matter," she continued. "Children from broken homes, children who went to bed hungry, children who believed the world had given up on them. But I never gave up on them." Margaret's voice grew stronger. "And I won't give up on you, because every story has another chapter, and yours isn't finished yet." The studio fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of reverence. Jimmy wiped his eyes openly, no longer concerned about maintaining his television image. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "you've just given the most important lesson ever delivered on this stage." Margaret smiled, the expression of a teacher whose student finally understood the lesson. Jimmy made another decision that defied every television protocol. He pulled out his personal cell phone and handed it to Margaret. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to call someone, anyone, your family, a friend, someone who should know that tomorrow morning you're not going to be sleeping on the street." Margaret looked at the phone as if it were a foreign object. "Mr. Fallon, I appreciate this, but I can't accept charity," she said with the pride of someone who had spent her life giving rather than receiving. "This isn't charity," Jimmy said firmly. "This is a community recognizing one of its treasures." He gestured to the audience, who were hanging on every word. "You taught our children, Mrs. Thompson. Now it's our turn to take care of you." The Roots, who had been silent throughout this extraordinary exchange, began playing something soft and hopeful. Questlove nodded at Jimmy, understanding that music was needed to hold this sacred space. "Mrs. Thompson," Jimmy continued, his voice gentle but determined, "you're not going back to the streets tonight. You're going to a warm hotel room with room service and cable television. Tomorrow morning, we're going to start figuring out how to get you home." Margaret's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her weathered face as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. For the first time in 3 years, someone was offering her not just help, but dignity. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her teacher's voice finally failing her. Jimmy knelt down beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. "Say you'll let us help you," Jimmy replied. "Say you'll let the thousands of children you taught over the years take care of their favorite teacher." Margaret nodded through her tears, unable to speak. The moment that followed became television legend. The entire studio audience rose to their feet, not in programmed applause, but in genuine recognition of what they had witnessed. Some people were crying, others were applauding, but most were simply standing in silent acknowledgement of human dignity restored. Margaret stood as well, wearing Jimmy's jacket like armor against a world that had forgotten her value. The image was captured by every camera in the studio, a homeless teacher, dignified and proud, surrounded by love and recognition. The show ended differently than any Tonight Show had ever ended. Instead of the usual closing music and wave goodbye, Jimmy stood with Margaret as the credits rolled, both of them silent, both understanding that they had participated in something larger than entertainment. After the cameras stopped rolling, something unprecedented happened. Instead of the typical rush to leave, audience members lingered, approaching Margaret with words of encouragement, offers of help, and simple human recognition. The woman who had been invisible for 3 years suddenly found herself surrounded by community. Jimmy personally escorted Margaret to his dressing room, where he called his assistant and arranged for her stay at the Plaza Hotel. Not a budget room, but a suite, with flowers and fruit and anything else she might need. But more importantly, he sat and listened as Margaret told him about her students. She spoke about Maria, who couldn't speak English when she arrived, but graduated as valedictorian. About James, who lived in his car with his mother but still completed every assignment. About Sarah, who was so shy she wouldn't speak above a whisper but grew up to become a teacher herself. "That's the thing about teaching," Margaret said. her eyes bright with memory. "You plant seeds without knowing which ones will grow. But they all grow, Mr. Fallon. Every single child I taught became someone important, someone valuable, someone who mattered." Jimmy realized he was witnessing something profound, a woman who had lost everything but still believed in the power of human potential. Margaret wasn't broken by her circumstances, she was refined by them, like gold tested by fire. The next morning, Jimmy's phone rang at 6 a.m. It was Margaret, calling from her hotel room to thank him, but also to ask if she could return his jacket. "Mrs. Thompson," Jimmy said, "that jacket belongs to you now. But I want you to know this is just the beginning." Within 48 hours, Jimmy's foundation had connected Margaret with social services, housing advocates, and legal aid. They found her transitional housing, helped her navigate the bureaucracy of benefits she was entitled to, and began working on permanent solutions. But the real miracle was what happened when the episode aired. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, The Tonight Show had received over 300,000 messages from viewers wanting to help Margaret specifically, and homeless educators generally. Donations poured in from across the country. Not just money, but job offers, housing offers, and invitations to speak at schools. Margaret found herself with choices she hadn't had in years, and the dignity that comes with being wanted rather than merely tolerated. 6 months later, Margaret returned to The Tonight Show, but this time as an honored guest rather than an audience member. She wore the same jacket Jimmy had given her, but now it was tailored to fit perfectly. More importantly, she wore the confidence of someone who had found her way home. "Mrs. Thompson," Jimmy said during her return appearance, "you've become a symbol of resilience for millions of people." Margaret smiled, the radiant expression of a teacher whose lesson had been learned. "Mr. Fallon," she replied, "you taught me something important that night." Jimmy looked curious. "What's that, Mrs. Thompson?" Her answer carried the wisdom of 4 decades in the classroom. "You taught me that the most important lessons aren't always planned. Sometimes they happen when we're brave enough to tell our truth, and someone else is brave enough to listen." Margaret Thompson now lives in a small apartment in Queens, volunteers at 4 different schools, and speaks regularly about homelessness, resilience, and the power of education. She keeps Jimmy's jacket in her closet, not as a memento, but as a reminder of the night when kindness changed everything. The Tonight Show established the Teachers Promise Fund directly because of Margaret's appearance, ensuring that educators who fall on hard times have support systems in place. To date, they've helped over 200 teachers avoid homelessness. Jimmy Fallon learned something profound that December night that changed how he approaches his platform. "I always thought my job was to make people laugh," he said later. "But Margaret taught me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is make people think, feel, and act." And in classrooms across America, teachers tell their students about Mrs. Thompson, the educator who lost her home but never lost her dignity, who lived on the streets but still believed in the power of hope. Her story reminds them that teaching isn't just about lesson plans and test scores. It's about showing every child that they matter, that their story isn't finished, and that someone believes in their tomorrow.